There have been comparative studies of conscription systems, and there have been comparative studies of family policy, but there's never been a comparative study that shows how family concerns affected conscription systems, and it is the first of its kind. They're also, even in studying the countries individually, this is something that almost nobody has paid attention to. And I think that has to do with the fact that conscription systems have been invested with so much ideological hope and so many ideological narratives. So in France, for example, one of the really important narratives about French conscription is that it was universal. It was a universal system, and it showed the equality of all male citizens. So to go back into the archives and actually find very easily, in fact, data that shows that there were all these exemptions that were built into the system really goes against this big national narrative. And I think also, in relation to these big narratives, it's very much become, conscription is associated with this kind of idea of masculine valor and heroic citizenship. And it's also justified it, it's ideologically justified it. And so to come from a feminist perspective and say, well, actually, there were all these competing ideals that pushed against the ideal of men's heroic citizenship is to tear away a little bit, to tear up a little bit these big narratives that were very dominant for over a century. Well, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon innovates by creating a universal conscription system in France. It's a new model where the idea is to try to have as much manpower as possible and become a major military force, and it works. And so parts in various other countries in the world, this is copied, and it's particularly copied at the start of the First World War. When there's this first global war, it's a total war, there's a comprehension on the part of warring states that in order to be competitive in this new era of warfare, you have to amass as much human material as possible. And that becomes the new model. And so the French system really innovated in that regards. And so did the Prussians. These are considered the two early innovators. And it becomes the world norm, certainly by the Second World War. And so even countries that gained independence after the Second World War, like Israel, explicitly copy the French system. The French system had the additional ideological elan that's typical of the French, in that they spoke of it as the people's army. And so this concept of the army not just as this utilitarian thing that a state needs, but also as a basis of citizenship, as an institution of belonging, is very much modeled after the French model of the people's army. The main conscription system that had existed in the United States was during the Civil War. And that was a very bitter experience on both the parts of the North and the South. And so for the rest of the 19th century and the early 20th century, no Americans would touch a conscription system. World War I happens, it takes a few years until the United States enters the war. They look around them, they see that all these other countries had implemented conscription systems, and they come to the conclusion that America should also have one. But there's this problem of the Federalist principles. And so the compromise is a federal draft system, but one which is very much mobilized at the local level so that it can adhere to Federalist principles. So there is oversight, but it's by design very loose oversight. The draft system, though, has been put on standby position since the 1970s, and it still has these really ossified ideas about gender roles and sexual identity. And so this case of Liz Kyle LaBelle looks like a case that's going to transform that, because this is a young woman who's arguing for her right to register with the draft system. But what the book shows, I think, is that the situation is quite complicated with regards to the draft system, and it's not like the all-volunteer force, in that it's structured so that local boards have a lot of say on an individual basis, and I wouldn't be surprised to see the reproduction of these outdated ideas about the appropriate family role for men and women through the local draft boards.